I still remember the exact moment my world tilted sideways. It was a Monday morning in September, the kind where summer still clung to the air and everyone moved through the hallways with that sluggish back-to-school energy. I was at my locker, organizing textbooks for second period, when the principal's voice crackled through the PA system with an announcement that made absolutely no sense. Attention all students. Effective immediately, you have a new mandatory elective called Chapelish Studies. Everyone needs to report to your assigned room instead of second period. Check the list posted outside the main office for your classroom assignment. I stood there with my chemistry book halfway into my backpack, completely frozen. Mandatory elective? That was already a contradiction. And what the hell was Chapelish? I looked at the students around me, expecting to see confusion mirrored on their faces, but everyone just seemed mildly annoyed about the schedule disruption. Nobody was asking the question that was screaming in my head. What country speaks Chapelish? My friend Alex caught up with me near the stairwell, and I immediately asked him if he knew anything about this new class. He shrugged with that typical Alex indifference that used to be endearing, but was starting to feel like willful ignorance. No idea, man. Probably some new program the district approved over summer. You know how they're always adding random requirements. But this wasn't random. Random would have been another semester of health class or a financial literacy course. This was a language nobody had heard of, announced on a Monday morning like it was the most natural thing in the world. I checked my phone during the walk to my assigned classroom, trying to find any information about Chapelish online. Nothing. Not a Wikipedia entry, not a language learning app, not even an obscure Reddit thread. It was like the language existed in some pocket dimension that only our school had access to. The classroom I walked into looked exactly like every other language classroom in the building. Alphabet posters on the walls, conjugation charts, vocabulary lists. Except these symbols were nothing I'd ever seen before. They weren't Latin letters or Cyrillic or Arabic or any Asian writing system I recognized. They were completely unique, angular, and flowing at the same time, arranged in patterns that seemed almost familiar but fundamentally alien. A teacher I'd never seen before stood at the front of the room. She was youngish, maybe early 30s, with an intensity in her eyes that made me immediately uncomfortable. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain where she came from or what qualified her to teach this language. She just started writing symbols on the board with swift, confident strokes. "I'll be teaching you the most important language you'll ever learn," she said, her voice carrying that practiced authority teachers develop after years in the classroom. "This is the Chapelish alphabet. You'll need to memorize these 37 characters by tomorrow. We'll start with basic phonetics today, then move into grammatical structures by the end of the week." I raised my hand before I could stop myself. "What country speaks this language?" The teacher paused mid-stroke, the chalk hovering above the board. She turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not annoyed, exactly. More like she'd been expecting this question and had prepared for it. "That's not important right now," she said carefully. "What matters is that you learn it. The cultural context will make more sense as you develop fluency." That should have been my first red flag. No language teacher in the history of education has ever said the cultural context isn't important. Languages exist because people exist. They develop in specific places with specific histories and specific needs. You can't separate a language from its speakers without fundamentally missing the point of communication itself. But I was 17, and sitting in a classroom full of students who seemed perfectly content to start copying down symbols without asking follow-up questions. So I shut my mouth and opened my notebook, writing down the strange, angular letters, while my brain screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. That night, I spent 3 hours trying to research Chapelish. I Googled every spelling variation I could think of. I checked language databases and linguistics forums. I even emailed 2 professors at nearby universities whose research focused on constructed languages and language acquisition. Nothing. The language didn't exist anywhere except in our school, introduced on a Monday morning without warning or explanation. I lay in bed that night staring at my ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening. In the rational part of my brain, I knew there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an experimental program testing new language learning methods. Maybe it was a constructed language like Esperanto, designed for some specific educational purpose. Maybe the administration would send out information packets to parents explaining the curriculum change. But the irrational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive by recognizing when situations felt wrong, was screaming at me to pay attention. This wasn't normal. Normal was announcements at the end of the previous school year. Normal was parent information nights and opt-out forms. Normal was gradual implementation, not mandatory participation announced on a Monday morning with no prior communication. Within a week, something even stranger started happening. Kids were already stringing together basic sentences in Chapelish, not just memorizing vocabulary or practicing conjugations, but actually communicating with a fluency that shouldn't have been possible after 5 days of instruction. I'd taken 3 years of Spanish and could barely order food in a restaurant. But these students were having conversations in a completely invented language after less than a week of classes. Alex was one of them. I found him in the cafeteria on Friday, talking with 2 other students from our Chapelish class, and I realized with a jolt that they were speaking entirely in this new language. The words flowed naturally, without the halting pronunciation and grammatical confusion that typically marks early language learning. They weren't translating from English in their heads. They were thinking in Chapelish. "Doesn't this freak you out?" I asked him after the other students left. "We've been learning this language for less than a week, and you're already fluent. That's not how language acquisition works." Alex looked at me like I was being deliberately difficult. "Why would it freak me out? The grammar is really intuitive. It's actually easier than Spanish, and I'm getting an A. Maybe you're just overthinking it because you want there to be a problem." That stung, because part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was creating drama where none existed. Maybe the language really was designed to be easy to learn, and I was resisting it because I didn't like being told what to do. Maybe my questions about its origin were just my way of being contrarian and difficult. But then I noticed the signs appearing in the hallways. Vocabulary posters in Chapelish. Motivational quotes translated into those angular symbols. Bathroom signs with Chapelish translations underneath the English. The language was spreading through the school like some kind of benign infection, growing beyond the bounds of second period and infiltrating every corner of our daily experience. Teachers in other classes started using Chapelish phrases. "Excellent work" became some string of syllables I couldn't quite reproduce. "Please turn to page 47" came with a Chapelish translation that students seemed to understand instinctively. The language was becoming normalized at a speed that defied everything I understood about institutional change. I kept asking questions. I asked the Chapelish teacher where the language came from. She smiled and told me to focus on fluency. I asked the principal about the curriculum approval process. He called it an innovative pilot program and changed the subject. I asked my parents if they'd received any information about this new mandatory class. They hadn't, but they assumed the school knew what it was doing. Every attempt to get answers hit a wall of deflection and reassurance. Everyone kept telling me the same thing. Stop questioning and start learning. Trust the process. Focus on your grades. Don't make problems where none exist. But problems did exist. I could feel them accumulating like pressure behind a dam. This language appeared from nowhere. It was being learned at an impossible speed. It was spreading through the school without anyone questioning why or how. And nobody, absolutely nobody, could tell me where it came from or what country spoke it, or why 17-year-olds in a suburban American high school needed to learn it. I started keeping a documentation journal. Every day, I wrote down what happened in Chapelish class. I took photos of the alphabet and vocabulary lists. I recorded the teacher's lectures on my phone, hiding it in my backpack so she wouldn't notice. I was building evidence for something, though I wasn't sure yet what I was trying to prove. By the end of that first month, Chapelish had completely transformed our school. Students spoke it in the hallways because they wanted to practice. Study groups conducted sessions half in English and half in Chapelish. Kids who'd struggled in foreign language classes were suddenly fluent in this invented tongue that had appeared 4 weeks earlier. And I was the only one still asking why. The only one who thought this situation was bizarre and wrong and fundamentally dangerous in ways I couldn't quite articulate. My friends thought I was being difficult. My parents thought I was overreacting. My teachers thought I was resisting for the sake of being contrary. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my brain hurt when I tried to think in Chapelish, in the speed at which everyone else was absorbing this language without question. Something was happening to us, and nobody seemed to care enough to ask what it was. The moment I realized we weren't alone changed everything. It was a Tuesday night in October, about 5 weeks after Chapelish had invaded our lives, and I was deep in a Reddit spiral trying to find any information about this language. I'd exhausted Google searches and academic databases, so I'd moved on to forums and discussion boards, hoping someone somewhere had encountered something similar. That's when I found the thread. It was only 3 hours old, posted in an education subreddit with the title, "Anyone else's school suddenly teaching a language called Chapelish?" My heart started racing before I even clicked on it. The original post was from a student in Colorado describing exactly what had happened at our school. Mandatory announcement on a Monday morning. New teacher nobody had seen before. Strange alphabet with 37 characters. Impossibly fast learning curve. The comments section was what broke my brain. Students from Arizona, Oregon, Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, 17 different schools across the country, all reporting the same experience. Same Monday morning announcement, same mysterious teacher, same angular alphabet, same grammar structures, same insistence that the language's origin wasn't important. I took screenshots of everything before the thread disappeared, which it did less than an hour after I found it. 1 minute it was there with 43 comments comparing notes and asking what the hell was happening. The next minute it was gone, deleted by moderators with no explanation. When I tried to access it through my saved links, I got an error message saying the content violated community guidelines. But I had the screenshots. 17 schools, different states, no geographic pattern connecting them, no shared district administration, no common demographic profile, just 17 seemingly random schools, all teaching the same invented language, all starting on the same Monday, all following the same inexplicable pattern. I stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, trying to make sense of this information. This wasn't just our school doing something weird. This was coordinated, planned, executed simultaneously across thousands of miles with precision that suggested serious resources and organization. Somebody, somewhere, had decided that students in 17 specific schools needed to learn Chapelish, and whoever that somebody was, they had enough power to implement a mandatory curriculum change without triggering any apparent oversight or resistance. The next day in class, I waited until everyone else had left before approaching the teacher. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to speak calmly. "I know about the other schools," I said. 17 of them, all teaching Chapelish, all starting the same Monday we did. Why these specific schools? Who selected us? The teacher's face went very still. For just a moment, I saw something flash in her eyes. Not anger, exactly. More like fear mixed with resignation. She glanced at the classroom door, then back at me. You were selected, she said carefully, based on specific criteria. What criteria? Selected by who? That's not important right now. What's important is that you focus on your studies. You're falling behind, and your resistance is only hurting you. I'm falling behind because nobody will answer my questions. Where did this language come from? Why are we learning it? What's the actual purpose of this program? She started erasing the board, her movements sharp and agitated. All languages are made up, she said without looking at me. They're all constructed by humans to serve specific purposes. Chapelish is no different. But they have origins, they have histories. They develop over time in specific communities with specific needs. This just appeared one Monday morning, fully formed with no explanation. The teacher stopped erasing and turned to face me. She looked exhausted, like she'd been having this conversation in her head for weeks. Some things, she said quietly, are meant to be learned, not understood. You need to decide if you're going to keep fighting this or if you're going to accept that you don't have all the information. I left that conversation feeling more unsettled than ever. Her words kept echoing in my head. Meant to be learned, not understood. What kind of education philosophy was that? Learning without understanding was just conditioning. It was training, not teaching. It was creating automatic responses rather than developing genuine comprehension. By month 2, the transformation of my social world was nearly complete. Alex stopped responding to my texts unless I wrote them in Chapelish, which I refused to do on principle. Our friend group study sessions were conducted entirely in this invented language, with kids switching between Chapelish and English without even noticing they were doing it. Conversations I tried to join would hit these walls, where suddenly everyone was speaking a language I was deliberately refusing to learn fluently. I was the only one still questioning, the only one who found this situation deeply wrong. My parents thought I was overreacting, fixating on something that wasn't actually a problem. My friends thought I was being unnecessarily difficult, making their lives harder by refusing to go along with something that was clearly benefiting everyone. My teachers saw me as resistant and contrary, a student who would rather complain than succeed. The isolation was crushing. I'd spent 3 years building these friendships, creating this social network, establishing myself in this school community, and now I was watching it all dissolve because I couldn't stop asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Every lunch period was awkward. Every group chat felt strained. Every interaction reminded me that I was on the outside of something everyone else had embraced. The worst part was that I could feel myself getting fluent despite my resistance. The language was working its way into my brain whether I wanted it or not. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking in Chapelish, these strange angular concepts forming in my head before I could translate them back to English. It felt like pushing through fog, like my consciousness was being slowly overwritten by patterns I hadn't consciously chosen to accept. Then came the day everything escalated. The teacher brought in a new textbook with symbols I'd never seen before. They weren't the basic 37-character alphabet we'd been learning. These were something else entirely. Ancient-looking, complex. And they hurt to look at for too long, like staring at an optical illusion that made your eyes water and your head pound. "This is advanced Chapelish," the teacher announced, distributing the textbooks to students who demonstrated sufficient fluency. "For those of you ready to progress to the next level, this is where the real learning begins." I watched as my classmates opened these books and started taking notes, their pens moving across the page in these flowing, incomprehensible patterns. They were writing in symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them, characters that looked different depending on the angle and my level of attention. And everyone else was following along perfectly, like these impossible symbols made perfect sense. "Progress to what?" I asked, my voice cutting through the scratch of pens on paper. "You keep talking about progression and understanding, but you never explain what we're actually progressing toward. What is the purpose of learning advanced Chapelish?" The teacher looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not annoyance, not pity, something closer to sympathy mixed with warning. "You have to be ready first," she said. "You have to stop resisting. Once you fully commit to learning, you'll understand why this matters. But you can't force understanding. It has to unfold naturally." The class continued in advanced Chapelish, and I couldn't understand a single word. Everyone else was taking notes, participating in discussions, responding to prompts with these complex symbolic responses that I couldn't even begin to parse. They were leaving me behind. Not because I lacked the ability to learn, but because I kept demanding answers instead of blindly accepting what was being taught. After class, I watched Alex and 3 other students having a conversation in the hallway. They were writing notes to each other in those advanced symbols, laughing at jokes I couldn't understand, existing in this linguistic space I couldn't access. And I realized I had reached a breaking point. I could either keep demanding answers and be completely left out of every social interaction, or I could give in. Stop asking questions. Learn the language. Accept that some things aren't meant to be understood. For about 5 seconds, I seriously considered it. The isolation was killing me. My grades were suffering. My friendships were dying. And part of me genuinely wondered if I was wrong, if I was creating problems where none existed, if I was being stubborn and difficult for no good reason. But then I remembered that deleted Reddit thread. 17 schools, coordinated implementation, no explanation. And I knew that giving in meant accepting something fundamentally wrong. It meant choosing comfort over truth. It meant becoming complicit in whatever this actually was. I went home that night with my head pounding like someone had been hammering nails into my skull. The advanced Chapelish symbols were burned into my vision even when I closed my eyes, these shifting shapes that seemed to exist in the space between seeing and understanding. I grabbed my documentation journal and started writing, describing everything that had happened in that class, the way the symbols hurt to look at, the speed at which everyone else was progressing, the increasing isolation I felt from refusing to simply accept what was being taught. I wrote about the cognitive changes I was noticing, the way thoughts would sometimes form in Chapelish before I could translate them to English, the strange clarity that came when I stopped resisting the grammar patterns, like my brain was being rewired to process information differently, the headaches that hit whenever I tried to think in both languages simultaneously, like there was some kind of cognitive conflict happening inside my skull, if something was affecting me differently than other students. I needed a record. I needed documentation of when these symptoms started and how they progressed. Because I was becoming increasingly certain that Chapelish wasn't just a language. It was something else. Something designed to change how we think, not just what we communicate. Tuesday morning, I woke up knowing I had to make a choice. I could either give up completely, let this language consume me like it had consumed everyone else, or I could fight back with the only weapon I had: documentation and process. My mom's suggestion from the previous week kept echoing in my head. Instead of just complaining about the program, I needed to focus on whether they followed the rules for implementing it. I spent my free period in the library that afternoon, researching Freedom of Information Act requests. The websites made it sound intimidatingly official, with specific language requirements and proper channels for submission. But the basic concept was straightforward. Citizens could request government records, and schools had to respond. I could ask for approval documents, funding sources, contracts with outside vendors. I could build a paper trail that would either explain what was happening or prove that proper procedures hadn't been followed. I copied down the template language for FOIA requests, noting which office handles these at the district level. It felt overwhelming, like I was trying to navigate some adult bureaucratic system I didn't fully understand. But it was better than just sitting in class watching everyone else disappear into this language while I screamed questions into the void. Lunch was becoming unbearable. I grabbed my tray and headed to our usual table, where I could already hear Alex and the group talking. Half the conversation was in Chapelish, words flowing so naturally that they didn't even seem to notice when they switched languages. They saw me approaching and made this visible effort to switch back to English, like they were accommodating a disability. I sat down and tried to participate in the conversation about weekend plans, but kept losing the thread when someone would make a joke with the punchline in Chapelish. Everyone would laugh except me, and there'd be this awkward pause while someone tried to explain the joke in English, which killed whatever humor existed in the original. By the end of lunch, I felt like my presence was this annoying burden, forcing everyone to work harder just to include me. That afternoon, I started what I called my symptom journal. I documented the headaches that had started with advanced Chapelish, rating them on a scale of 1 to 10. I described the mental fog I experienced whenever I tried to think in this language, like pushing through something thick and resistant. I wrote about the weird cognitive snap during vocabulary drills, when the grammar suddenly made sense but in a way that felt wrong, like my brain was being rewired without my permission. Other kids weren't reporting these symptoms. They were saying Chapelish made their thinking clearer, helped them process information faster, made complex ideas easier to articulate. So either I was having some kind of adverse reaction, or I was resisting so hard that my brain was fighting back. Either way, I needed a record. I pulled out my phone and composed an email to 3 linguistics professors at nearby universities. I kept the tone professional but detailed, explaining that my school was teaching a language called Chapelish that didn't exist in any database I could find. I attached photos of the 37-character alphabet and examples of the grammar structure, asking if they recognized any patterns or could identify what language family it belonged to. I mentioned the 17 schools teaching this simultaneously, all starting on the same Monday with no explanation of its origins. I said I was trying to understand where this came from and whether it was normal for schools to teach something with no documented history or academic foundation. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure I sounded curious rather than crazy, then hit send to all 3 professors. By Thursday, I had responses from 2 of them. The first was polite but basically useless, suggesting Chapelish might be a constructed language created for educational purposes, like Esperanto. The second professor's response was longer and more technical, analyzing the grammar patterns and noting they didn't match any known language family. But neither could explain why 17 schools would simultaneously teach something that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. I forwarded both responses to my phone and saved them in a folder with all my other documentation. 2 more pieces of evidence confirming what I already knew. This language appeared from nowhere, and nobody outside our schools had any record of it existing. Friday morning, I went to the nurse's office complaining about eye strain and persistent headaches. The nurse ran through standard questions about screen time, sleep, hydration. When I mentioned the headaches started with advanced Chapelish and got worse after each class, she barely acknowledged the connection. She gave me a vision test, declared my eyes fine, and told me to drink more water. I left feeling dismissed, like my symptoms had nothing to do with the one thing that had actually changed in my life. Saturday afternoon, I got access to the school building through my mom's connections in the district office. I walked through empty hallways with my phone out, photographing every piece of Chapelish signage that had appeared over the past month. Vocabulary posters in the main hallway, grammar reminders near the cafeteria, sports terminology in the gym. The library had a whole shelf of Chapelish materials now: workbooks, readers, reference guides. What started as one class had infected every corner of the school. It wasn't just a language anymore. It was becoming part of the school's identity, spreading into spaces that had nothing to do with second period instruction. Monday morning, the principal held a Q&A session in the auditorium about school initiatives. I showed up early, claiming a seat where I could raise my hand and actually be seen. When he opened the floor for questions, I walked to the microphone and asked directly, "Where did Chapelish come from? Who approved adding it to our curriculum? Why did 17 schools across different states all start teaching it on the same day?" The auditorium got quiet. I could feel people staring, but I kept my eyes on the principal, waiting for an answer. He smiled and launched into scripted talking points about innovative pilot programs and future-ready skills. How Chapelish was preparing students for a changing world. How it had been carefully designed by education experts with full administrative support. I asked again, who specifically approved it, and when? He just repeated the same phrases about pilot programs and innovative approaches, never actually answering where the language came from or who made the decision to teach it. Other students asked questions about parking passes and sports schedules, and the moment passed, leaving me with absolutely no new information. That afternoon, I texted Alex asking if we could hang out like we used to. He showed up 15 minutes late to the coffee shop, immediately pulling out his phone to check messages. He was in 3 different group chats planning Chapelish study sessions, his attention divided between our conversation and whatever was happening on his screen. When I brought up my concerns about the program, he sighed and said I was making everything harder by fighting instead of just learning. Maybe if you put this much energy into actually studying, you'd be fluent by now and wouldn't have all these problems. We left without making plans to hang out again, and I realized our friendship was dying, not because of some big dramatic fight, but because I couldn't stop asking questions that made him uncomfortable. Tuesday evening, my mom dragged me to a PTA meeting where the administration was presenting updates about Chapelish. The principal and 2 teachers stood at the front with a slideshow about future-proof skills and college admissions advantages. Parents asked practical questions about workload and grading and tutoring options, but nobody challenged the basic premise. Nobody asked where the language came from or who approved adding it to the curriculum, or why their kids were learning something that couldn't be used anywhere outside these 17 specific classrooms. The administration answered every practical concern with detailed explanations, while completely avoiding the fundamental weirdness of the entire situation. I watched my mom's face during that presentation, seeing her growing unease as she realized how thoroughly the parents had been managed. They were being given just enough information to feel informed without actually understanding what their children were participating in. Wednesday in class, I looked at the sample assessment questions posted for next week's test. Every question was a controlled response prompt. Fill in the blank. Choose the correct grammatical structure from 3 possibilities. No open-ended questions. No writing prompts asking us to express original thoughts. No listening comprehension requiring us to interpret meaning from context. Just pattern recognition and memorized responses. We weren't learning to communicate. We were being trained to produce specific predetermined responses using exact grammatical structures, like we were being programmed rather than educated. Thursday after class, I stayed behind for office hours. "Why do you keep telling me to stop resisting instead of answering my questions?" I asked. "Where did this language come from? What are we really learning it for?" The teacher looked exhausted, rubbing her temples like she had a headache. "You need to focus on fluency. Your grades are suffering. You're spending all your energy fighting instead of learning, and at this rate you're going to fail even though you clearly have the ability to succeed." "But I can't discuss those details. You need to trust that the administration knows what they're doing. Her hands shook as she gathered papers from her desk. She wouldn't make eye contact, and I realized she was as trapped in this as I was, following orders she didn't fully understand or agree with. That weekend, I forced myself to do the Chapelish drills from the workbook. 2 hours on Saturday afternoon, working through vocabulary exercises and grammar patterns. About an hour in, something weird happened. The grammar suddenly clicked in a way that felt completely wrong. My brain just accepted these patterns without questioning them anymore. The symbols and structures making sense in a way that felt too easy, too fast. I could form sentences without thinking about the rules, the language flowing naturally even though I'd been struggling with it for weeks. The ease of it scared me more than the difficulty ever did, because it felt like something was rewiring my brain, making me think in ways that weren't natural, but felt effortless once they took hold. I stopped the drills and sat there staring at the workbook, trying to figure out what had just happened inside my head. This wasn't normal language acquisition. This was something else. Monday morning before school, I spent an hour digging through district policy documents on the school website. I was searching for anything related to the Chapelish program, any record of the approval process. What I found was revealing in its absence. Every other curriculum change from the past 5 years had detailed documentation, parental notification procedures, consent forms, board approval with public comment periods, opt-out options clearly listed. But there was nothing about Chapelish. No record of the standard protocols being followed, no consent forms, no board meeting minutes discussing the program, just this glaring gap in the documentation where proper procedures should have been but weren't, like someone had deliberately bypassed all the normal channels designed to protect students and parents from experimental programs being imposed without permission. That evening, I created an anonymous account and posted in a local parent Facebook group. I kept the details vague, not naming Chapelish specifically, but asking if other parents had noticed issues with new programs being implemented without notification or opt-out options. Within an hour, I had 3 comments all saying basically the same thing. Trust the school administration to make good decisions. Kids these days are too protected. They need to learn to adapt. Nobody seemed concerned about the consent issue at all. Nobody thought it was weird that schools could make kids participate in experimental programs without explicit parental permission. The blind trust was almost more disturbing than the program itself. By Wednesday, I was completely iced out of study groups. The isolation hit me during lunch when I walked past a table where my friends were working on homework together. They saw me coming and went quiet, then resumed their conversation in a mix of English and Chapelish that I couldn't fully follow. Nobody invited me to sit. Nobody asked if I wanted to join their afternoon study session. Later, I overheard 2 girls from my history class talking about how I was making things harder for everyone by refusing to just go with the program. "She's being so dramatic about this," one said. "It's just a language class. Why does she have to turn everything into some big conspiracy?" The message was clear. My questions and resistance were disruptive and unwelcome. People would rather exclude me completely than deal with my continued refusal to simply accept what was happening. Thursday afternoon during class, I flipped to the back of my advanced Chapelish textbook looking for publication information. There was a small vendor logo I'd never noticed before, printed on the inside back cover. I wrote down the company name and spent that evening searching for connections between this vendor, our school district, and the 17 other schools teaching Chapelish. The company specialized in educational assessment technology. They had contracts with several testing organizations and partnerships with private foundations focused on standardized evaluation methods. I started sketching out a corporate trail, looking for financial connections and shared board members, any pattern that might explain why these specific schools were selected. The vendor had received a large grant from something called the Educational Innovation Foundation, right before our school year started. That same foundation had connections to research programs, studying language acquisition and cognitive assessment methods. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that was deeply disturbing. That evening, I found Reddit usernames from 3 students who'd commented in that deleted thread. I sent direct messages asking if their advanced Chapelish textbooks had the same vendor logo and whether their schools received special funding right before the program started. 2 responded within an hour, both confirming identical logos and grants from the Educational Innovation Foundation just weeks before Chapelish launched. The pattern was undeniable. 17 schools didn't randomly decide to teach the same invented language on the same Monday. This was coordinated, funded, and deliberately implemented by an organization with serious resources and specific goals. Friday morning, I showed up at the guidance office asking to talk with Mr. Madden about my grades and stress levels. He listened while I explained how my GPA was dropping because I couldn't focus in Chapelish class, how all my friends had stopped including me in study groups. He nodded sympathetically, then leaned forward with what I'm sure he thought was helpful advice. You need to stop fighting battles you can't win and focus on your actual schoolwork. The program was approved by people with way more information than you have access to. You're creating your own problems by refusing to go along with something that's clearly helping other students succeed. He suggested I use my energy on homework instead of activism, reminding me that colleges wouldn't care about my concerns if my transcript showed failing grades. I walked out feeling worse than when I went in, because even the counselor whose job was supposed to be helping students was telling me to shut up and accept what was happening. That evening, my mom found me in my room staring at my laptop screen full of notes and research. She sat on my bed with this careful expression and said we needed to write a formal letter to the school board, something professional that adults would take seriously instead of dismissing as teenage drama. We spent Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table working on it together, organizing my scattered concerns into clear paragraphs, asking about parental consent procedures, transparency requirements, and whether the board even knew about the foundation funding. Sunday morning, I posted in that parent Facebook group again with a more measured tone, asking if anyone else wanted more information about the pilot program. This time, I got a response from someone named Camilla Zimmerman, who said she was a reporter covering local education issues. She sent me a private message saying my concerns sounded worth investigating and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what I'd observed. Monday afternoon, I called Camilla from my room with my door closed. We talked for almost an hour about everything I'd documented over the past months. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, the vendor information, the other schools, taking notes the whole time. Then she explained how FOIA requests actually worked, walking me through the specific wording I needed to use to request approval records, funding documents, and contracts with private companies. Tuesday morning before school, I filled out the FOIA request forms online, using the exact language Camilla had helped me craft. I hit submit on both the district request and the state education department request, then sat back feeling this weird mix of official and powerless. Now I had to wait 30 days for responses, which felt impossible when I wanted answers immediately. 2 weeks later, an email appeared from the district's records department with a PDF attachment, 20 pages of documents, but most covered in thick black redaction bars blocking out whole paragraphs and sections. What I could read mentioned a private foundation providing grant funding and multiple references to non-disclosure agreements restricting what information could be shared publicly. The response included a cover letter explaining that certain details were protected by contractual obligations and couldn't be released under FOIA exemptions. I forwarded everything to Camilla within minutes. She called that evening and we went through the documents together line by line, with her explaining the legal language and helping me understand what the unredacted portions actually meant. She'd already started researching the foundation name that appeared in a few places, discovering it specialized in educational technology and standardized testing, not language instruction or cultural programs. Camilla found research papers the Foundation had published about creating bias-free testing environments by using completely neutral vocabulary that eliminated cultural advantages. And suddenly, the whole Chapelish program started making sense in a completely different way than I'd been thinking about it. I sat at my desk that night reading through the Foundation's materials, and the pieces clicked together in my head. This wasn't about teaching us a language for communication. The program was creating a standardized testing tool that worked by forcing everyone to think within the same tight grammatical rules and limited vocabulary, so nobody had cultural or linguistic advantages over anyone else. The clarity everyone kept talking about wasn't some magical property of Chapelish. It was just the cognitive ease of working inside a system with no room for interpretation or creative expression. Students weren't becoming fluent in communication. They were being trained to produce specific predetermined responses using exact structures that could be easily measured and compared across different schools and populations. We were research subjects, test cases for a controlled lexicon assessment system, and nobody had told our parents or asked for consent or given families the option to opt out. I started rewriting my concerns in a new document, shifting away from arguing that Chapelish was fake toward asking questions about consent and transparency. The issue wasn't whether controlled lexicon testing had educational value. It was whether districts could implement experimental programs funded by private foundations without informing parents or giving families the option to opt out. It was whether students should be test subjects for corporate research about language acquisition and cognitive assessment without anyone explicitly agreeing to participate. Wednesday afternoon, I found the school board member contact information on the district website. Eli Rearon's email was right there with his photo and a short bio. I opened a new message and started typing, keeping my tone respectful and curious rather than angry. I explained I was a student in the Chapelish program and had obtained FOIA documents showing private foundation funding, NDAs restricting transparency, and no parental consent procedures for what appeared to be educational research. I attached the relevant documents and asked if he was aware of these elements when the board approved the program. I read through the email 3 times before hitting send, making sure every sentence focused on specific procedural questions rather than attacking anyone personally. Thursday morning, I woke up to a response that completely surprised me. Eli said he'd like to meet briefly to discuss my questions and suggested my mother attend since these concerns involved district policy. He admitted he wasn't aware of NDAs or private foundation involvement when the board reviewed the program, and he sounded genuinely interested in understanding what I'd discovered. My mom immediately agreed to meet with him. We scheduled it for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop, which felt surreal because I'd never imagined a school board member would actually take my concerns seriously. Tuesday afternoon, we walked into the coffee shop and found Eli already sitting at a corner table with a notepad. He stood to shake our hands and thanked us for taking the time to meet. I pulled out the printed FOIA documents and spread them across the table, pointing out the references to private foundation funding, contractual restrictions on information sharing, and data collection protocols never mentioned to parents. Eli read through each page carefully, and I watched his expression shift from polite interest to visible discomfort. He explained the board's approval process had focused entirely on educational benefits, with the principal presenting Chapelish as an innovative pilot program. Nobody mentioned private foundation involvement or research protocols or contractual restrictions. If he'd known about those elements, he would have asked very different questions during the approval meeting. He closed the folder and said he was going to request that Chapelish be added as an agenda item for the next board meeting so these questions could be addressed publicly. The board approved the program based on limited information, and if there were transparency issues or consent gaps, those needed to be corrected regardless of how well the program worked educationally. Walking back to the car, my mother squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of how I'd handled the meeting, staying focused on facts and procedures rather than getting emotional or defensive. Thursday after school, the Chapelish teacher caught me in the hallway and asked quietly if we could talk. We stepped into an empty classroom and she closed the door, then asked why I was trying to undermine the program when it was helping so many students learn faster and think more clearly. I explained I wasn't against students learning Chapelish, but against the lack of informed consent and transparency. Parents deserve to know about the research component and foundation funding before their kids were enrolled in what was presented as just a language class. She looked tired and stressed, admitting she was under enormous pressure from the administration to maintain enrollment numbers and show positive outcomes because the grant funding depended on participation rates. She said she'd wanted to be more transparent from the beginning, but the NDA she signed restricted what she could discuss about the program's origins and purposes. She felt trapped between doing her job and being honest with students and parents about what was really happening. That confession confirmed everything I'd suspected. She wasn't evil or malicious. She was just a teacher trying to keep her job, caught in a system that prioritized research outcomes over student welfare and educational ethics. The following Monday, the principal called me to his office during lunch. I knew before I even sat down that this wasn't going to be friendly. He started by saying he'd heard I was spreading misinformation that could damage the school's reputation and put important educational opportunities at risk. I tried to explain about the FOIA documents and the meeting with Eli, but he cut me off. Your activism is creating unnecessary controversy and making other students uncomfortable when they just want to focus on learning. You need to think about the bigger picture of what's best for the school community. He never addressed any of my specific questions about NDAs or consent procedures. Instead, he focused on how my behavior was disruptive, how I needed to be a team player. I left his office feeling angry and frustrated because he'd completely ignored the substance of my concerns and tried to frame everything as me being difficult, rather than the administration failing to follow proper procedures. Wednesday evening, Camilla called with news that changed everything about how I understood the principal's role. She'd been digging through public records and foundation materials and discovered the principal sat on an advisory panel for the same foundation funding the Chapelish pilot program. This was a significant conflict of interest that was never disclosed to the board or parents, and it explained why he'd been so defensive about transparency questions. Camilla asked if I was comfortable with her including this information in a story she was planning to publish before the board meeting. I said yes without hesitation. Parents deserved to know about the financial connections that might be influencing how the program was presented and defended. My mother called the school Thursday morning and requested a formal meeting with the principal to discuss transparency and parental notification procedures. She brought printed copies of the FOIA documents, laying them out on his desk and asking direct questions about why parents weren't informed about the research component. The principal became defensive, insisting the program was properly approved and parents had been notified through regular school communications about new course offerings. My mother pointed out there was a difference between announcing a new language class and disclosing that students would be research subjects in a private foundation study. The lack of opt-out procedures was particularly concerning. The principal agreed to provide more information to parents, but framed it as clarification rather than admission of any procedural failures. My mother left the meeting feeling like he was more worried about protecting the school's reputation than addressing legitimate consent issues. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, the district sent out a memo to all families with students enrolled in Chapelish. The memo reframed the program as an optional enrichment opportunity pending comprehensive review, which was the first time anyone had suggested it might not be mandatory. The language was carefully worded to sound like this was always the plan, describing the program as a pilot initiative that families could choose to continue or discontinue based on their individual preferences. My mother read the memo twice and said the sudden shift suggested the administration was worried about public scrutiny at the upcoming board meeting. I saved a copy because it contradicted everything we'd been told for months about Chapelish being a required part of the curriculum. The social split happened fast. Within days of the memo going out, you could see clear lines forming in the hallways between kids who thought I was making a big deal out of nothing and kids who started questioning whether this whole thing was actually okay. People stopped sitting together at lunch based on which side they were on. Group chats divided into pro-Chapelish channels and questioning channels. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but suddenly everyone knew I was the one who filed the FOIA requests and talked to the reporter and got my mom involved. Conversations would stop when I walked past groups in the hallway. I could feel people watching me, judging whether I was brave or just causing problems for no reason. Tuesday night, I started drafting a petition. I realized attacking the program itself wasn't going to work because too many people liked it and were doing well. But consent and transparency were different. Those were principles that should matter to everyone regardless of how they felt about Chapelish. The petition didn't say Chapelish was bad or demand it be shut down. It asked for 3 things: complete information about funding sources and research purposes, voluntary participation with no academic penalties for opting out, and proper consent procedures going forward for any similar programs. I printed 20 copies in the library Wednesday morning and started approaching people I thought might sign. The first few conversations were awkward because I had to explain I wasn't trying to end the program, just make it optional and transparent. Some people refused immediately, but others read the petition carefully and said the consent stuff made sense even if they planned to keep taking Chapelish. By Thursday, I had 15 signatures. By Friday, I had 30. Over the next week, I kept collecting signatures during lunch, before school, between classes. I approached kids I barely knew, explaining the petition in the same careful way each time. Some signed because they agreed with my concerns. Others signed because they believed in procedural fairness, even though they loved Chapelish and thought I was overreacting. A few teachers signed too, quietly when I caught them alone in their classrooms. They didn't want to be public about it, but they agreed students and parents deserved complete information before being enrolled in experimental programs. The petition grew to 50 signatures, then 70, then 90. By the end of the week, I had 112 signatures, which felt significant even though it was only a fraction of the students enrolled in Chapelish. Monday morning, the administration sent out a new memo to all students. It didn't mention my petition by name, but the timing and content made it obvious what they were responding to. The memo reminded everyone that district policy prohibited certain types of organizing during school hours that could disrupt the learning environment. It said students who wanted to advocate for policy changes should work through proper channels like student government or parent committees. The memo warned that continued disruptions could result in disciplinary action. The message was clear: stop collecting signatures or face consequences. The hallways felt tense after that memo went out. People who had been considering signing my petition backed off, afraid of getting in trouble. Kids who had already signed started asking if they could remove their names. I told them the petition was voluntary and they could withdraw if they wanted, but I wasn't stopping. The administration's warning actually convinced me this mattered more than I'd realized, because if they weren't worried, they wouldn't be trying to shut it down. Tuesday afternoon, the guidance counselor called me down to his office. He had my file open on his desk and a concerned expression that looked practiced. He said he'd noticed my grades dropping and my stress levels seemed really high based on reports from teachers. He suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about anxiety, maybe getting an evaluation to see if medication could help me manage these feelings. I sat there understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't about helping me. This was about reframing my activism as a mental health problem, making it seem like my concerns came from anxiety rather than legitimate questions about consent and transparency. I told him my stress was a normal response to watching an experimental program get rolled out without proper oversight. My anxiety wasn't a chemical imbalance that needed treatment. It was a reasonable reaction to an unreasonable situation. Wednesday evening, my mother showed me a post in the parent Facebook group from Alex's family, a long defense of the Chapelish program praising its innovative approach and the opportunities it was creating. Then it shifted to criticizing resistance to the program, suggesting it came from people who didn't understand modern education or were resistant to change. The post never mentioned me by name, but the comment section filled up with pointed remarks about students who create drama instead of focusing on learning. I read through them feeling more alone than I had since this whole thing started. These were parents I'd known my whole life, now calling me dramatic and difficult without using my name. Thursday afternoon, Camilla called with an update. Her investigation was ready to publish, scheduled to go live 3 days before the board meeting. But she needed an on-the-record parent source to make the story credible, someone willing to be quoted by name about the consent concerns and lack of transparency. I asked my mother that evening, explaining what Camilla needed. She sat quietly thinking about it for a long time, understanding that being quoted by name would make our family visible in this controversy. But she said transparency was important enough to take that risk. If she was asking the school to be transparent, she needed to be transparent too. Friday afternoon, the school board posted the agenda for their next meeting. I refreshed the page obsessively until the PDF finally loaded. There it was, listed under new business, Chapelish program review and community input. The listing said the item would be addressed in open session, which meant community members could attend and speak during public comment. Seeing it there in official board meeting language made everything feel suddenly real. My months of documentation and questions were finally being taken seriously enough to warrant discussion at a public meeting. That night, I got an email from the Chapelish teacher that surprised me. She said she wanted to apologize for her tone in our previous conversations and for not being more helpful when I asked questions. She explained she'd been following a tight script dictated by her contract and the NDAs she signed. She wanted to answer my questions from the beginning, but was legally restricted from discussing the Foundation's research goals or the data being collected on student language acquisition patterns. The email felt like a confession, an admission that my instincts had been right all along. She was just a teacher trying to keep her job, caught between contractual obligations and students who deserved honest answers. I stayed up late Sunday night preparing what I'd say at the board meeting. My mother helped me organize everything into a clear timeline. When Chapelish started, when I discovered the other schools, when I filed the FOIA requests, when I learned about the NDAs and foundation funding, we arranged the documents in order, highlighting the key points about consent procedures and transparency failures. I practiced presenting the evidence calmly, keeping my voice steady and factual. My mother reminded me to focus on procedural questions rather than attacking individuals, to frame everything around the principle that students and parents deserve informed consent before participating in experimental programs. The board meeting room was already filling up when we walked through the doors at 6:30. Parents claiming seats in the rows of folding chairs, students clustered near the back wall, teachers sitting together on the left side. I spotted the local news camera setting up in the rear corner. Camilla was in the press section, her laptop open and phone recording audio. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I walked to the sign-up sheet for public comment and wrote my name in the third slot. My hands were shaking enough that my signature looked messy and uneven. At 7 o'clock exactly, the board president called the meeting to order. They went through standard procedural stuff about approving minutes and reviewing the agenda. My leg was bouncing up and down without me meaning to do it, and I had to force myself to sit still and focus on breathing normally. The first two people who signed up for public comment spoke about budget concerns and athletic program funding. Then my name was called. I stood up, my folder of documents clutched against my chest, and walked to the microphone stand in front of the board table. I opened the folder and pulled out my timeline sheet, setting it where the board members could see it. Then I started talking in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. I explained how Chapelish appeared at our school on a Monday morning with no prior announcement or parental notification. How I discovered through online research that 16 other schools started teaching the identical language on the same day. How my attempts to find information about its origin led nowhere until I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the district. I held up the FOIA responses showing the redacted references to private foundation funding and the multiple mentions of non-disclosure agreements that prevented school officials from discussing the program's research purposes. I explained that students were learning this language with unusual speed and reporting cognitive changes, that the program expanded from a single class to signage throughout the building, that participation became effectively mandatory, with no opt-out procedures or parental consent forms. I presented the petition with over 100 signatures from students and parents asking for transparency about funding sources, data collection protocols, and the research purposes behind the program. My 3 minutes were almost up, so I finished by asking the board to require full disclosure of the foundation partnership and make participation voluntary with proper informed consent procedures. I could see several board members leaning forward and taking notes, while others were looking at their phones with concerned expressions. When I returned to my seat, my mother grabbed my hand and held it tight. The board president asked if staff wanted to respond to my testimony, but the principal said he would prefer to wait until all public comment was finished. While the next person was walking to the microphone, I saw board members passing phones to each other and pointing at screens, their faces getting more serious as they read something. Camilla was typing rapidly on her laptop, and I realized her story must have just gone live. The headline was probably showing up on board members' phones right now, with all the documented evidence about undisclosed conflicts of interest and missing consent procedures. The next two speakers defended the Chapelish program, talking about how their kids were excelling. But then a mother stood up and said she was angry that nobody told her the program involved research or data collection on her child. Another parent asked why there were no consent forms or opt-out options when every other pilot program in the district required parental permission. A father said he felt blindsided, learning from a news article that his son was essentially a research subject in a study funded by a private foundation with connections to the school administration. After nearly 40 minutes of public comment, the board president closed that section and asked the principal to present the administration's perspective. The principal stood at the microphone and delivered talking points about innovative pilot programs and future-ready skills. But Eli interrupted him to ask a direct question about the non-disclosure agreements. The principal looked uncomfortable and said he was bound by contractual obligations, which made Eli turn to the district's legal counsel and ask whether the board's original approval was based on complete information about the foundation partnership and data collection protocols. The attorney shifted in his seat and admitted that the full scope of the research component and the NDA requirements were not included in the initial presentation to the board back in August. The presentation had focused primarily on curriculum benefits and student outcomes, without explaining the private funding source or the restrictions on discussing program purposes. Eli asked why the board wasn't informed about these elements, and the attorney said the administration believed they had discretion to negotiate partnerships without board approval as long as they stayed within approved budget allocations. Another board member asked about the conflict of interest, since the principal sits on an advisory panel for the foundation funding the program, and the attorney acknowledged that connection should have been disclosed before the board voted on approval. The room got very quiet as board members processed this information and looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were realizing they had approved something without understanding what they were actually approving. The discussion continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about the foundation's research goals, the data being collected, and why standard consent procedures weren't followed. The principal finally proposed a temporary pause on the mandatory requirement, while a review committee examines the program's implementation, consent procedures, and data protocols. The board president asked for a motion to convert the pilot program from mandatory to opt-in status, pending the review committee's recommendations. Eli made the motion, and another board member seconded it immediately. When the vote was called, all 5 board members raised their hands in favor. The motion passed unanimously. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, mixed with exhaustion that made my whole body feel heavy and tired. My mother hugged me right there in our seats and whispered that she was proud of how I handled the pressure and stayed focused on principles, rather than attacking people personally. 3 days later, I got an email from the district asking if I would join a review committee to help redesign the Chapelish program as a voluntary elective. The committee would include 2 other students, 3 parents, 2 teachers, and Eli as the board representative. Our job was to make sure the new version had real consent procedures and clear information about what students were signing up for. The first review committee meeting happened on Tuesday, and I walked into the conference room feeling nervous about whether adults would actually listen to student perspectives. But Eli started the meeting by saying the whole point was to make sure future programs included real student input from the beginning. We spent 2 hours drafting consent form language and communication protocols that would apply to all future pilot programs. The whole process felt meaningful and collaborative instead of adults just telling us what they already decided. My friendship with Alex started slowly getting better as the divisions around Chapelish faded and people stopped treating it like you had to pick a side. We started eating lunch together again on Thursday, just the 2 of us at first, talking about normal stuff like video games and weekend plans instead of constantly arguing about the program. 3 months after the board meeting, the district formally adopted new policies requiring parental consent and transparent disclosure for all partnerships with private foundations or vendors that involved student data collection. The policies included mandatory 30-day review periods before programs could start, clear opt-out procedures that didn't penalize students academically, and quarterly reports to the board about ongoing research programs. I sleep better now knowing I asked the right questions even when it was socially hard and emotionally draining. My relationship with my mother got stronger because we worked together on something that mattered to both of us. My boundaries with friends are clearer because I know I can disagree with people without losing them completely. And I understand that speaking up for transparency isn't about being difficult. It's about protecting everyone's right to make informed choices about their education and their data. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is ask questions when everyone else has stopped asking. But those questions matter. They protect us. They keep institutions honest. They remind people in power that they serve us, not the other way around. That's what I learned from Chapelish. Not the language itself, but the importance of consent, transparency, and having the courage to stand alone when standing alone is the right thing to do.